with Daniel Sloan, and we're excited to be bringing you today's Culture of Research and Education webinar called Writing the Dissertation, Practical Tips for Success. Some of you may remember the first installment of this webinar, which happened last month. This is a follow-up, and if you haven't caught that one, we'll make sure to get you that link after this. The core webinar series is designed to provide faculty, students, and alumni an opportunity to share their research and scholarship with the Trident community. By fostering a culture of professional development and idea exchange, participants will have access to a valuable forum for lifelong learning. This university-wide effort is coordinated by Trident doctoral studies directors. Just a couple notes for everyone before we begin. You're welcome to ask questions and share your experiences with today's subject matter at any time. You can do that in the questions box, which can be found about halfway down the control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. Please avoid using the chat function or the hand-raising function. It's much easier to communicate via the question box. You'll also find some helpful resources which will be mentioned during the webinar, and we'll get those out to you after the session. This webinar will be recorded, and all attendees will receive a link to the session and a copy of the slides. We'll try to get those out to you by the end of this week. Today's session will be hosted by Dr. Heidi Smith, Dean of Trident's College of Education. She joined Trident in 2014 as Director of the EDD program. She has over 20 years of experience in higher education administration, including time at California State University, Long Beach, where she launched that institution's EDD program. She earned an EDD in Community College Higher Education Leadership from CSU Long Beach, as well as master's and bachelor's degrees from San Diego State University. Her research interests include access, retention, and persistence of underrepresented college students, financial literacy of college students, and professional development of student affairs personnel. Welcome, Dr. Smith. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Danny. I'd like to welcome everyone to today's webinar on Writing the Dissertation, Practical Tips for Success. This is the second of two webinars that offers a student perspective and dissertation chair perspective about how to navigate the development of a dissertation and how to work with your chair. I'm going to take a moment to introduce you to our presenters, starting with Dr. Allison Deegan. She currently serves as our doctoral mentor in Trident's College of Education, where she focuses on guiding doctoral students to dissertation success. During her time at Trident, she has authored the Graduate Writing Handbook, guided 14 EDD program students through the dissertation process, and is currently chairing 15 EDD program students. Dr. Cammy Romanuck Murphy is an alumna of the Trident's EDD and Educational Leadership Program. She's currently a private contractor of speech-language pathology, providing services to students across the United States via the telecommunication platform. She also works part-time as a freelance academic editor. Both these presenters will provide valuable insight into the dissertation process, and with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Deegan.
Thank you, Dean Smith, and welcome everyone. We're really happy to be here. In our prior webinar focused on dissertation success, we realized that writing is a big component of it. We can't cover everything today, but we're going to try to take you through some of the things that will really set you up for success. Things like format, content, editing, APA, the mechanical things, but also talk about how to work with your chair, and most importantly, what to do if you get stuck. So hopefully we'll cover enough to give you a sense of confidence going forward. We're going to open up for questions at the end, and we'll be available. You can contact us if you have additional questions going forward. So let's start with reading and organizing before you write. One of the things that is really, really important when you're writing the dissertation is, we're going to talk about time and management and things like that, but just basic organization. It's a big project. Many, many, many moving parts. You'll have piles of literature all over the place. You'll have the electronic version of piles of literature all over the place. So it's important for you to remain organized and just really get a sense of what the roadmap of your dissertation is. If you set up a roadmap, I like to call it a roadmap rather than an outline, because a roadmap, you can make a a sharp turn if you need to. You're not wedded to a route that's carved in stone for you. And sometimes outlines are hard to move. They seem less mutable when you're writing. So think of it as a roadmap. And if you need to turn, if you need to double back, if you need to combine, you're going to be able to do it. You'll have the fluidity. So we recommend that you have that roadmap and that you actually write under it. But really, any way you approach your writing, it's got to be with a very, very specific organizational plan. And that comes after you've just done a lot of reading. It's hard to organize your lit. It's hard to get a sense of the field if you haven't read deeply. Now I'm talking about reading a lot and organizing a lot. Remember, we're going to be repeating this theme throughout. Both of those things require time.
Absolutely. And they sure do. I can attest to that. I just finished my dissertation last year in January, so this is all pretty fresh to me. And so when we say know your goals and your literature, because that directs what you write, to me that really meant having a clear problem of practice, because without a clear problem of practice, you're not really sure what to write about. And so your writing is very unfocused, and you're not really even sure how to develop an argument for the need for your study. So for me, I felt that really spending a lot of time on the front end with my literature was very helpful. And then that way I was able to really hone in on what I needed to write with that detailed outline that we talked about. So, and I'll tell you from personal experience, at first I didn't know what literature I should be looking at or exactly what my goals were, because my topic was very broad. I originally was wanting to look at many stakeholders, different stakeholder groups and their perspectives on a given topic, which was, for me, inclusive special education. And so I was writing a whole bunch of different ways, and I was pulling literature from all over the place, and it was very overwhelming. And so after working with my chair, I whittled down the focus of my study, which was key. So instead of looking at multiple stakeholders, I was looking at one stakeholder group, which is educational leaders and their perspectives on inclusive special education. So after I had that, I was able to hone in on the literature that I needed and the argument that I needed to develop for my own study because of a hole in the research that I found. So that being said, it was very helpful to create this roadmap that Dr. Deegan talked about. And when I say roadmap, I do essentially mean a very, very detailed outline. And that was very helpful, especially when creating the literature review and narrowing down the topic for my individual arguments. How I did this was I created headings and subheadings and subheadings. And that becomes very important because it keeps your writing very focused. So an example of this in my study, which was again about special education, in my literature review, I had the history of inclusive special education as a big header. That's a big topic. And then under that, I had a subheader of the 1950s and 60s, because I knew that there was a lot there, but there was still too much just to talk about the 50s and 60s. So of course, then I used subheading. And then I talked about two major things that happened during that time. And that was the civil rights movement and the Association for Retarded Citizens, which of course is not okay to say anymore, but then it was a very big deal and they made a big impact on the community. And so once I had these headings set up, then I was able to plug in information and kind of stay on track with my writing. So lastly, I will say it's very helpful to organize all of your materials for each article or each chapter, depending on the kind of dissertation that you're writing. And so if I'm to back it up and tell you exactly what I did in stages to stay organized and focused in my writing, the first thing was to spend a lot of time with the literature on the front end. Just identify exactly where the hole in the research is, what your problem of practice is going to be, where your argument for the need for your study is. And then secondly, I started to build an annotated bibliography, and I organized it into topics, because an annotated bibliography can become a very big document, so it's good to organize it into topics. And then third, I created that detailed outline, and then headings, subheadings, all of that. And then I was able to pull from my annotated bibliography and plug in the relevant literature, which I'd spent a lot of time with, under those headings, and create a focused and cohesive paper. So with that being said, we're going to switch topics a little bit. And on the next slide, we'll be talking about why format is so important in academic writing.
I get the impression that some students think we are sticklers for format because we're hazing them or we don't have anything better to do, and neither of those is true. Format is important because when you're writing in an academic frame, you need to have a dialogue with your reader. You always have to think about your reader, how they're perceiving your work. It's not work just for you. It's not work just for your committee. we're all technically writing work for the field, and that includes a variety of readers, some subject matter experts, some not. So we're always thinking about that reader. And if you present your work in an atypical format, use substandard citation, don't have clarity, don't have all the signposts that academic writing requires, your reader then reverts to a position where they're no longer in a conversation with a peer scholar. They're on suspicion. They're wondering, where is this from? How is this work done? Who is this author? Should I trust it? They start to deviate from what you really want with them, which is a dialogue about your content. Doesn't mean they have to agree with everything you're presenting, but they have to trust that you're a scholar of equivalent merit, that they can give you their time. And what I like to tell students is, if you deviate from format, if you lose your reader's trust on those simple things like that, it's because they think you don't know any better or you don't care to perfect your work. And if you're comfortable with either one of those perceptions being held by your reader, I think you're in the wrong business. We need to keep the reader on our side. We need to tell them we understand the form of academic writing, what the requirements, the standards, and we're delivering it to them so that they can engage with our content. That's why format is really important.
I think within all the disciplines at Trident University and the doctoral programs, everybody's writing an APA. And so if you are an APA, just stick with the guidelines. Like everything Dr. Deegan said, there are many reasons why you must do that in academic writing. It is best practice, absolutely. And I think it does become very confusing to a reader if you're doing things like putting footnotes into an APA paper, or you're adding first names into in-text citations, and it really does look careless. And I can attest to that with my experience, because when I was writing my dissertation, I did a lot of research and I reviewed many, many dissertations. And there were a couple that stand out in my mind that were great topics, and I probably would have loved to have incorporated much of their research and their literature into my own literature review, into my findings, some of that. But their ideas were great, but their APA was not. And when I saw a lot of errors that seemed careless to me, like putting in the first names within in-text citations, I did lose faith in them as a credible writer. And it might not sound fair, but it's true, and that's what the reader's going to think. And what it made me wonder was if they had that same type of lackadaisical attitude towards their own research and the rigor of their independent research, and whether what they were citing was true. And I wanted to make sure that my own paper was as strong as it could be, and it was always credible. And so I was very hesitant to use their articles in my own, because that's not what I wanted for my own paper. So I didn't use them. So that's just kind of a lesson learned, and from my experience as well. And so while we'll talk about editing for APA, next we're first going to be talking about wearing different hats in terms of editing for different purposes once you start writing your dissertation.
The reason we call it different hats is there are different mindsets. These tasks are very different. What I like to tell students is you have to design a house. An architect has to design it, an interior designer has to decorate it, and if you're lucky. And then you have to clean it. We don't ask the architect to clean the house, right? We don't use a mop to design the house. These are different things. They're all important for the success of that living space, but we have to approach them differently. So we like to think of the writing tasks and many of the editing tasks, especially the more mechanical ones, as different hats, different rounds, different runs of cleaning and perfecting. And if you separate them in that way, they're easier to engage with. It will give you the two views that you need. You need the big picture, overarching view of your study, what it's composed of, what its goals are, what you'd say in the abstract to let the world know what this study is about. But also, you're also responsible for line by line, the nitty gritty, all the detail, everything that is between the cover sheet and your final page. Those are all important too. So you have to tend to both. I have never encountered a student that has the wherewithal to attend to all of them at all the time. One editing run and you capture it all. It just doesn't work that way. So if you engage in your content and bring it as well as you can bring it, and then Cammy's going to talk a little bit about these multiple hats that you wear, one after the other, perfect your content from these different perspectives, that's a better process to go about it. Again, it's a process that requires time you're going to have to find. But that's the way to approach it.
And I learned a lot about editing throughout my dissertation process, and I realized very, very quickly that trying to edit for everything all at once is not the best strategy. So when I first started, I would get writing, and then I would try to attack the editing task all at once. So I would be looking for cohesiveness, flow, transition words, grammar, word order, APA, everything you can think of, I was trying to edit for, and that just wasn't very efficient. I found it was time consuming and my attention was going 101 different directions, and ultimately I was missing a lot of mistakes. And so what I found to be a more effective strategy was putting on these metaphorical editing hats, and I like to edit in passes. So one day I might have a writing goal. I like to always set writing goals. So maybe it was creating that outline that we talked about, and then I would plug in some information and get some sections down on paper. So that was great. And then the next day I was going to edit, but I was only going to edit for flow and maybe some of the content, making sure everything kind of made sense together. And then I would take another pass at it, and I would edit for spelling mistakes and grammar, just a couple of things at a time rather than trying to do everything all at once. And what ends up happening when you go through multiple times, yes, it's time consuming, but not more time consuming than trying to do it all at once, but certainly more efficient and effective. But what ends up happening is you catch little errors each time you go through, just by chance you do. And so you end up editing a lot more thoroughly and cleanly, and your document comes out a lot stronger in the end. And one more note that I'd like to say about editing, and when you're wearing these different editing hats, make sure that you put on all your hats and write your strongest paper every time you go to submit something to your chair. And edit like you're submitting to IRB, or edit like you're getting ready to publish your dissertation. And the reason I say that is because your dissertation chair needs to really understand where your writing skills are at if they're going to be giving you feedback that's going to make you grow as an academic writer. And if you're giving them documents that are half done or full of errors, they don't know where you're at, and they won't know what kind of coaching you need. So that would be my best advice, is to do the work on the front end to save yourself time later, and so that you can learn and grow more and get your study done and your dissertation to be a cleaner and more cohesive document overall. So with that being said, we're going to move on to conquering APA.
Before I get to that, I just want to say one other thing about that point about showing your chair and your committee, here's the best that I can do. Don't get caught into the bind that many students fall into in writing, which is, I don't have good work to show, so I'll show you nothing. That's a big mistake. So even if you are behind, if you haven't done everything you hoped to do or promised you would do, or planned to do, and then it all fell apart, at a minimum, show your chair in segments. Every time you submit something, show them at least one section and say, this section or these 2 pages or whatever, this subsection, I can't make it any better. I think it's perfect. This is the standard that I'm working with. So then they can correct based off that sample, even if they can't see the whole perfect version of your work. So don't hold back your work and give nothing if you can't do it perfectly. Give them at least something that you're saying is perfect. You've done as good as you can do, and they can diagnose backwards from there and figure out what kind of assistance you need. So now moving on to APA. Students are always having challenges with APA. It's very common. You're not the only one. And I send them to the Concise Rules, which is the small size spiral bound book. You can get it off the APA website. There's also the big book, the one that looks like a phone book, the 6th edition, the big book. I think you need both if you're going to be involved in academic writing. But I would say I get 90% of my answers from that Concise book. So I carry it around in my bag. I always have it with me. So I can quickly look things up. And you may wonder, why am I always looking things up? I've been using APA for 30 years. Why am I looking things up? That's because I think it's impossible to memorize. There are some that I know how to cite a regular journal article, but as soon as I am confident, here's exactly how it goes, I'm like, let me just look that up. And I look it up again and again and again, because I need it to be perfect. The standard is perfect. So your source, your reader can always find those sources. So using the Concise Guide will get you 90% of the way there. then we have to look. We have to use the Purdue OWL, we have to use other resources, we have to use the big book with some of these electronic sources or personal sources or just really unique sources that we're encountering in the modern era of research. Sometimes it's very hard and you have to go and look things up or look to other sources. Sometimes I go on the OWL and experts are debating how to cite something, so not everything is clear. But most of your answers are going to come from that little book, and I'd encourage you to get it, to use it, to put sticky notes all over it so you can easily get to your citation format again and again and again. And that way, you're going to be as good as you can be in your initial drafting, and then when you go back with one of those passes to perfect, you will have APA that does its job, connects your reader directly to the source of your citation if they choose to go there.
And it is, for me too, it's totally impossible to memorize all the rules. Like you said, I don't think anybody can. I don't know what you'd have to do to be able to do something like that. But I found myself using the APA guide a lot. Also, Purdue OWL I use very, very frequently. And if you're unsure about something, just take a minute, go check it out. And then I recommend cleaning and perfecting as you go when you're editing for APA. And I say that because it becomes very tiresome if you've written a whole paper and then you're going back and writing for or editing for APA. You find yourself wondering or realizing that you're maybe missing some citations and having to scramble and try to find where on earth you found this article from. So it's just better to clean and perfect as you go, and just know that there are lots of great resources out there for you in the writing tips handout that we have provided to you. Go take a look at it because we included some of these credible resources, and there's links to all of them. There are books, there are websites, and always you can always speak with your chair too, but there are all those resources there for a reason. So the next thing we will be talking about also has to do with APA, and that has to do with avoiding this question, for this is applicable to both the reader and you as a writer. Where did this information come from?
When your reader is asking that, there's a good chance you may have already lost them. You may have broken the trust with the reader, and they're wondering, is this opinion? Is this uncited? When you do things like put the cite in the middle of the paragraph, they don't know, does the stuff below and above attached to that cite? They just start to get confused. And what I have figured out, first myself as a reader, and then talking to many, many people who read academic work, is the first thing you do is you read visually. So you'll look at a paragraph and you'll see a citation. You'll get a sense this material that comes after is linked to that citation, and then there's no citation, there's no citation, there's no citation, there's too many sentences. To ask the reader to infer all the way back to the top that all this material comes from that citation, or maybe it doesn't. The reader doesn't know. They start to get confused. They start to lose trust with you. They have to scroll back up and reorient themselves. Every time they come back to your paper, they put it down and come back to it. They have to reorient themselves. So providing them both actual citation that gives them that clue, but also presenting it in a way that gives them a visual clue about where these things are from, where these sentences are from, is the best thing you can give to your reader. It keeps them staying in your content. It keeps them in a trustful relationship with you so that they just want to engage with what you've written and aren't distracted by the form in which you've written it. And one of the tools that I use, I call it cite on the way in, cite on the way out. If you have a paragraph from the same source, it works best. Medium-sized paragraph. It doesn't work with a super giant paragraph, and for a short paragraph, you probably won't need it. But a medium-sized paragraph, what we mostly write, you start your piece saying, Smith, 2012, found that blah, blah, blah. Sentence, 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 maybe one more sentence. By the fourth sentence, the reader is just really close to saying, where is this from? But they spy down at the last line of the paragraph, Smith, Smith, 2012. They see that closing cite. So they see the cite on the way into the paragraph, and they see a cite on the way out of the paragraph. And it allows them to eyeball that and just read your content. Just engage with your content. And you may have a line somewhere in the middle that's uncited material, but they won't notice. They'll just trust that you're providing them that clue of how citation is going. Now, the alternative to something like that, if you have multiple authors in a paragraph, you'll have to do the traditional way. Leave the cite as close to the sentence or all of the content that it's certifying as possible. Some students, when I say, cite on the way in, cite on the way out, or I say, where is this from? They overreact and they provide me a citation on every sentence. Not a good look. That's so distracting to the reader. It's like poking the reader in the eye, and it starts to look like you're just pulling stuff from the article, and you're not synthesizing it. So cite on the way in, cite on the way out. The placement of your citation is also a clue to your reader about what kind of synthesis you're doing. If you're not truly synthesizing, if you're going article by article, this article said this article said that, the reader also will start to think, what do I need you for? Why don't I just go read those articles? You're not giving me any unique spin on the content. You're not interpreting it in any way. You're not synthesizing it, and you're not reiterating points with multiple authors. That's what we rely on you to do as well as an academic writer. So those visuals that show them where is the content coming from, and those visuals that show us, oh, these points are coming from multiple sources, the author is synthesizing. They keep the reader on your side. They keep you in a dialogue about your content and not distracted by where your content may be coming from.
As a student, I would say right off the bat, I always have to be really mindful of citing sources, but right off the bat, I recommend oversighting rather than underciting, just because you can always revise that later, as you should, as we talked about those strategies just now, as Dr. Deegan said. Because the reader, yes, you're going to lose credibility with them if they're wondering, where did you get this information from? But as a writer, like I kind of alluded to in the previous slide, I did this, don't do this. if you can learn from my mistakes. If you write under one of the detailed outline that we talked about, or the roadmap, and you've got all this great literature and it belongs there, but you've forgotten to cite, and then all of a sudden you're going, where did I get this from? So it's just not applicable just from the reader, but it's for you too. And it will take a ton of time to try to go back and find where you found that most likely. So my advice is to oversight when in doubt, revise later. You can always remove citations. You should be synthesizing and putting citations together. Do what you have to do after, but just avoid that question of where on earth did I get this from? And another note too, of course, is you don't want to be in academic writing making blanket statements or putting your opinion a lot into your paper. You just want to make sure you can back what you're saying from the literature as much as possible. So,
and one other point I just want to make about that, one other point is when I'm critiquing students on their citation format, where's your synthesis, where's this, where's that, some react by moving to direct quotes only, and they'll give me a draft with 100 direct quotes. That doesn't let you off the hook for being required to synthesize. Direct quotes should be used really, really sparingly, and only, in my opinion, when you can't synthesize or paraphrase that information. That's when you default to a direct quote. You don't default to a direct quote to let yourself off the hook from having to synthesize. So think about that and save those quotes for the really, really powerful language that aligns with your thesis, that really reiterates your thesis point, not just, here's what so-and-so said, direct quote, read it and weep. That's not your job. Your job is to be the author of something that's bringing multiple sources together. So direct quotes are useful when they're in the right place, but they're not a way to get beyond your responsibility to synthesize.
Yeah, that's a good point. And one other thing I'd like to say about citations too, I won't talk anymore about citing on the way in and out, because Dr. Deegan did address that, and that's also outlined in your handout. But something that I did initially, and then I'm seeing now as a freelance academic editor, and I'm seeing this quite frequently, is, okay, so I'll use myself as the example. When I was doing research and reading a lot of different articles, I found some golden articles, you might call them. And so what I mean by that is I found a few dissertations that just had everything that I was looking for. I mean, it was a similar topic. Their literature review was helping me to understand what I wanted to develop for my literature review, or maybe I was loving their methodology and I'd wanted to do something similar. So you get these very few golden articles and you want to just cite everything from them because they're perfect. But what can happen is, and I've seen this, and Dr. Deegan talked about this a little bit too, but I started writing paragraphs and everything was from golden article number 1, let's say Smith. So here I've got a paragraph and everything is Smith. Everything in that paragraph is from Smith. And then the next paragraph, because I love that article so much, is also from Smith. And then I have another golden article, and so the next paragraph all of a sudden is all from Dr. Deegan. And it's just Dr. Deegan, but you're only seeing the one reference in one paragraph, and that's a very choppy way to do things. And I think that also that way you're not really synthesizing information. So a better technique is to take your time with the literature, take a look at it all, and kind of weave these articles together so your paragraphs are more well-rounded. So it's the literature and what you're explaining to the reader. It gives a better picture to you, but also to your reader. And that brings me to the last point about synthesis. I think oftentimes in graduate programs and undergraduate programs, certainly in mine, the intro classes that you take and the papers that you write for practice end up looking more like book reports. You're stating facts. It's very simple. And so there's not a lot of synthesis of information, and you'll learn and grow over time. But certainly when I started my doctoral program, I received a lot of guidance about how to synthesize. And so it's a higher level skill. And in many ways, when I was reading through dissertations for my research, I feel that the synthesis can differentiate an okay dissertation from a very, very strong or impressive dissertation in many ways. And so spending a lot of time up front with the literature on the front end, that helps because you're able to kind of sit with the literature that you're reviewing, and you're able to think it over and kind of see how it fits together to back up the need for your study and the literature review that's relevant for your study. But also you have to be organized. And for me, that was through an annotated bibliography. For others, that might be hard copies of your articles with notes and highlights, however you're going to do it. But just make sure that you're able to organize in some way that you can go back, reread, synthesize, and then write. And so we will switch gears a little bit now, and our next slide is about writing to your dissertation format.
And format, the overarching format, what the expectations of your chair, committee, and department are quite specific. They're specific to program. Every program should have a dissertation guide. And you need to follow that format within a range of individuality, again, guided by your chair. You're able to do that, but you should know that format. I'm a big fan, again, of plugging that format right into your document and making sure that your roadmap comports with what is required, all the components. Everybody's going to have an intro and a conclusion, but in the middle, some are using 3 articles, some are using projects. Some are using a traditional 5-chapter, some even do a 4-chapter. There are deviations. So you've got to follow that guidance really, really meticulously. And one of the main reasons is so that you don't have a giant mess at the end. You're going to be most tired at the end, right when you're ready to defend, when you need to perfect your dissertation for filing and uploading to ProQuest. These are times when you can't collapse and have this huge format burden. So it's okay to go through and defend, and your dissertation isn't super finalized, but it has to be in the format that your department expects. You should be provided with examples. Sometimes the example is a content example to give you guidance on how to go forward content-wise, but sometimes an example is just a format example, and that can be very comforting. It doesn't matter what the other person has written. You're looking at their format, how they presented it, how they've put their references in or whatever. And don't be afraid of the ProQuest database. I would say that you will find a range. Even if you're looking at your same exact format, you'll find a range of interpretation from other universities. So you can't be enchanted by any of that. You always have to be in line with your chair and your department. But managing the format part of it, you'll never be so happy that you did. It's like opening a closet and finding, oh, somebody already cleaned out this closet. It's perfect. You don't have to have the burden of sorting everything out. It's already in line, and you can just focus on what you came there to find. And that's how you want your dissertation to be perceived as well. So format tells all of those things to your reader as well.
Yeah, I won't say too much more about this topic because I agree with everything that you said, but when it comes to format, everybody's going to be learning. That's the whole thing. In my discipline, we did a 3-article dissertation, and that was something I'd never heard about before, but I really just followed the guidelines within my discipline's handbook, and that was very, very helpful. Other things that were helpful were templates to work off of, but these exemplars that Dr. Deegan was talking about, it was just really nice, especially if I got stuck and I wasn't sure how to do something or structure something. It was just nice to have some sort of example to look off of. So anyway, that being said, we'll move on to our last topic, and that is what happens if you get stuck while you're writing your dissertation.
it's likely to happen. Even the best of students, I think I had a student ask me once, am I cursed? I'm writing my dissertation and all these challenging things are happening. I must be cursed. And I said, you're not cursed. You're writing a dissertation. And every student I've ever worked with is adding that into an already jam-packed life. They're not saying, I'm quitting my job, kids are going away, no longer have a spouse, I'm just writing my dissertation. Nobody gets to do that. So we're adding this giant project on top of our life. It means life events, when you have no spare time, are going to upend you. And they almost always come out in the wash in the dissertation, almost always in the writing. So I just haven't found a student who is doing this all on their own. You're doing it as a team. You're doing it in a collaborative setting with your chair, with your committee, with your department, with your classmates, if you can form a supportive group of classmates. So if you get stuck, there's help available. This webinar is an example. You can have a proofreader, you can have an editor who helps you with conceptual things. Certainly you can get much of that from your chair and from your committee. If you're doing statistical analysis, your committee is going to be a key source of guidance on that part. The key is, don't sit there and suffer. Don't sit there and be paralyzed. Don't sit there and stick with substandard work because you alone don't know how to fix it. Keep yourself in dialogue. Keep yourself in collaboration with your whole team. And whether it's an external source like the Purdue OWL or a book or a handbook or whatever, or it's that personal source that's going to focus on you and your issues, your challenges, your writing, your dissertation. I'm of the mind that I think you need both. I think a handbook alone won't do it. I think relying on that person alone is a little risky because you might burn out on one another. You might not know the question when you're able to talk with them, and then it's 2 in the morning and you can't ask the question. You know, the human factor has a limit as well. So I'm a fan of doing both. Find as many external sources that resonate with you as you can, and we're going to give you a few of them, but also have those people beyond your committee that can support you, that can give you guidance, or that can help you. You know, you can find an editor that doesn't have to be an expert in your field. They're just editing. They're looking at APA. They're helping you raise the level of your presentation. They certainly can't help you with the content. That's more coachy. That's more dissertation chair or whatever. But be open that if you get stuck, you're not alone. Everybody does, and it's mostly incumbent on you to reconnect with your team and get the help that you need.
And everybody really does get stuck, and I think it's important that you aren't afraid to ask for help. And so that can come in many forms. So maybe it's your classmates, maybe it's your colleagues, friends, family, editor, a chair. Everybody can help in different ways. So just don't be afraid to reach out for help, because you are not an island, you are not alone. And writing a dissertation isn't easy, and it's not supposed to be. And I think everyone has different needs, and everybody has very different needs. And mine were specifically, I needed some coaching and mentorship, because even in my former grad programs, I'd never done an independent study all by myself, because I'd never written a thesis and I'd never done everything from scratch. And even what I did learn, I was much more familiar with quantitative designs. But what I needed was coaching to get through the whole process that was qualitative. That's what I was choosing. And it was a huge learning curve for me. And I really needed support in that and getting through that process. And that's what Dr. Deegan really helped me to do. And others, maybe you've done independent research in the past. Maybe you have done a thesis already. It just depends on your needs. Maybe your struggles are more in grammar or in APA or just the basic principles of academic writing. And so maybe you need to look to other sources for that. But it doesn't matter. The fact of the matter is there are tons of resources out there available to you. And we're all here to help. And don't be afraid to ask for help. And last but not least, when it comes to writing the dissertation, and we've alluded to it, well, addressed it directly many times, but time. Always be aware of time and carve it out whenever you can, because time can be your friend and it can be your enemy, but it can really be your friend. But I would advise using it wisely and really carving out focused time where you can focus just on your dissertation. And sometimes that involves conversations with your family, when they know that when you are downstairs or upstairs or wherever it might be, you need uninterrupted time to the maximum extent appropriate. And certainly, if you can work ahead, do. Everybody faces barriers throughout the dissertation process. I did when I was recruiting participants and securing a site, and various things came up, but I had time on my side, luckily, because fortunately, but fortunately, because I had taken the time to work ahead and carve out time. And so I was able to get done and have enough time to spend with my data, which, again, give yourself enough time, certainly when you're collecting data and analyzing your data, but time. And one thing that we have done, time. And we can go to the next slide, because what I'd like to talk about just very briefly is that if you do have struggles with time management and prioritization, there are many resources available to you to help address these. And it's on one of the handouts that we've provided. And within that handout, we've attached links to podcasts and books and websites and articles that can help you to improve in those areas. And oftentimes, if that's an area of need with your dissertation, it kind of tends to trickle over to personal and professional life too, so you can actually improve in those areas personally and professionally as well. We've also included a few other handouts for you. We've included to-dos and not to-dos, some basics that are really, really good to review for when you're writing your dissertation, developing your dissertation and writing it, also working with your chair. And then the writing resources handout, or the writing tips that we've talked about, you have to look at that because it is golden. It's a wonderful handout, chock full of great information as you're getting going in your dissertation process. The personal dissertation editing checklist we do not have provided for you today, but that's something I would encourage for you to develop. You can also find samples online and links. So this is something that I like to develop based on my own needs. You can find, again, start somewhere from a link that you find online and look at the handbook that's been given to you by your department, and you can develop a checklist. So when you're going through and wearing these different editing hats, you can have focus and kind of check things off as you're editing so that you have the strongest paper possible.
And we're going to be, Dan is going to find a way to get these handouts to anyone who's on the call today, but also we're going to be finding a way to host them in a way that you can find these resources. And don't forget, your department has a dissertation handbook. So while it's not necessarily going to tell you how to write it, it's got a lot of resources and a lot of support in there. So be sure that you've looked through that and discuss it with your chair so that you're prepared to do, like I said, the combination of personal help and then resource finding and review on your own. I think you need to cover both specters in order to have the help that you need. And I think that's all we have, and we can hopefully have some questions that we can talk you through. So we'll go back to Dan.
Thank you both for your insights on the writing process. I think we've made it very clear that the dissertation can be challenging, but a rewarding experience. I'm certain we have some questions, so I'm going to turn it over to Danny for our Q&A.
Great, thank you, Dr. Smith. And yeah, both our presenters talked about the resources today. Those will be sent around to everyone, and we'll also be hosting a couple places as well, probably doctoral resources page, which you can find on the Trident website, and probably turning them into some blogs as well. But they're really valuable, and hopefully they help you out. We have a few questions in already, and as a reminder, if you want to submit a question, just send it in by the question box in the control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. And first question, this one's for you, Dr. Romanuck Murphy. And the question is, I'm 2 courses away from my oral and written exam, parentheses, task 7 in the dissertation handbook. Can you please elaborate more on the dissertation protocol you undergo with your dissertation committee, beginning at the oral and written qualification process and ending with task 20 approved dissertation? And let me know if you want me to read any of that again, because it's a little long.
Okay, no. So I don't know exactly what those tasks are off the top of my head, but I do know what the process was like for me, and I think it's different by every department. And I think that Dr. Smith and maybe Dr. Deegan can help me with this a little bit. Maybe you're more familiar with what that looks like. But my advice is to print off or save on your computer the dissertation handbook. like a checklist. I like to do that too. Obviously, I like checklists. They're very helpful. But just go through everything that it's telling you in the order that it's telling you. Get it done one step at a time. Don't get overwhelmed. But when it comes to the oral defense and submitting your dissertation, I can speak to my program, and that was a dissertation series of classes. So I went through them, and in each series I was able to develop more parts of my dissertation and work with my chair very directly throughout that process. And then when it was time, as guided by that handbook and the checklist, I was able to submit my documents after getting through IRB and then schedule a call for the oral defense with my committee. I'd selected a committee members as well, but that also was on my timeline. So that all should be outlined for you in your discipline's handbook. And then after you do your oral defense, you will likely get some feedback from your committee members. You can go ahead and make changes, revisions, or redefend if you must. But then after that, you get to go ahead and you can start working on submitting to ProQuest and so on and so forth. But that being said, that's my experience in my discipline. Dean Smith, can you talk to that more? Is that different in different disciplines? Yeah, so I just want to interject that's a question from a PhD student, and that program's managed a little differently than the EDD. We don't actually have a formal proposal defense as we do in the PhD. What our students do is they complete a proposal course, which is EDD 614 under the guidance of Dr. Deegan, and that proposal is reviewed and submitted in cooperation with Dr. Deegan and myself to make sure that the student's able to progress and be transferred over to a dissertation chair. But it sounds like the process is probably similar in terms of how the final oral defense is managed. Our EDD students are not actually permitted to defend unless we know that they are prepared to pass their oral defense. PhD programs run a little differently. Some chairs may allow you to defend and have you get more extensive feedback from your committee and require you to defend again. I don't think that happens too often. So again, I would just refer you back to your student handbook just to check the protocol and what the protocol is in your given program.
And your chair's interpretation of that protocol as well.
Yeah, and always communicate with your chair.
Thank you. And next question, this one's for Dr. Deegan. How important is it to use sources that have been published within the past 5 years?
I think in every topic, you're going to have those foundational sources. You know, a great example I always use with students is Maslow. You know, Maslow was from 70 years ago, but Maslow has trickled up to many, many modern studies. They're still founded on Maslow. So you probably need a Maslow site, but if all of your work is from 50 or 60 years ago, you know, we're doing work that's important to the field today, unless you're doing some type of historical dissertation or study. So modern sources are really important. They're part of that component of keeping that trust with your reader, that this is worth reading, that this is going to be important, that I'm going to learn something from it. So the integration of the foundational historical or even the older literature with modern interpreters of it or new interpreters, right? Because remember, every dissertation is supposed to be looking for a gap. So the presumption is newer work has newer ideas in it, has newer ways to fill those gaps. So it will be more valuable. So I would say at a minimum, you have to do both, but your emphasis should be on newer. I don't know about 5 years. I usually, my window is usually 10 years. And if it's older than 10 years, I kind of need to know why. I want to vet every one of the sources that way. But don't be afraid of modern sources. If they're in a peer-reviewed journal, they're not untested. They're actually tested. But don't be wedded only to the more dusty historical sources or foundational sources. Don't be afraid to pair them with very, very emerging research. And that's my practice, is to do both.
Great, thank you. And next question, this one's for you, Dr. Romanuck Murphy. You mentioned golden resources. When doing a dissertation, how do you know when you start to become over-reliant on those resources?
I'll be honest. yeah, that happens. But you do know pretty quickly because you tend to keep gravitating to this article. And now, let me be clear, I guess, about one thing about these golden articles. They can also be a wonderful resource because what can happen, and I'll use a resource that I always turn to, and I loved this person's dissertation, is their literature review. I needed a lot of that information for mine, and I did not pull from theirs. I looked at a variety of resources, but what you can do is actually use their dissertation as a resource too, because oftentimes if it's a recent article, they've cited articles that are also recent that give you the literature that you're looking for your literature review. So you can go and look at those authors, search for those articles, read through those, synthesize through those, and use them in your own writing. So they can be a very good thing too. But just know if you're looking at these golden articles all of the time and sourcing just from them and their findings all of the time, it's probably time to look for other articles that can support what you're saying as well. Just because you do really want a well-rounded picture of the literature, you want that synthesis, and you want to make sure the reader is also understanding that your article is coming from a very well-rounded place. It can't just all be from one article. So you'll know.
I think another way to think about it is that it's a foundational article. Sometimes that is some of the older literature. It's when this field first came together, or some scholar from years ago first identified a phenomenon and named it. So the instinct to rely heavily on those foundational articles to make your case for what you're going to add to it, that's a good one. It just can't be a full recounting of that article, right? The reader is going to sit there and say, well, I already read that. What do I need you for, right? So you need to honor it, cite to it, use it to set up what you're going to build on top of it, and then move on to the more current sources. So even your foundational article, your golden article, you'll have to judge the limit of it. And your goal in your dissertation is not to recount the entire thing.
Great, thank you. Next question, and that's this one's for Dr. Deegan. Could you describe how to make an annotated bibliography using Word or EndNote?
I don't use EndNotes, but it's easy to do in Word. What I ask students to do is just set up a template. In the College of Ed, we have a template available. When you take the pre-dissertation course with me, you'll get that. And what we're asking is key questions about every site you're looking at. What is, first and foremost, what's the full citation? If you lose track of the full formal citation, you'll be so sad you did later on. As Dr. Murphy said, where did I get this from? Now I have to go dig through a million articles to try to find it. So we want you to, every article you encounter of any significance, we want the full citation. We want to ask you things like, why is this article important to you? Why did you stop on it? Why did you pull it? What are some key quotes from the article? What are some of the ways in which you could incorporate it? How does it interact with what your work is or what your thesis is as you're forming it? And you just put that in a Word document, usually a page per article, usually comes out. You don't copy the whole article, but you don't copy one line. You give us those key quotes, give us those impressions. And as you go back to it and read it more and highlight it, you can add more to your annotated bib. The goal is, so say you have 100 articles in your annotated bib, then I ask students to reformat it by topics. So they just cut and paste in a Word document. It's very easy. They put their big roadmap or outline topics, and all the articles are lined up, already annotated. Big quotes are already highlighted. With that, that's how you synthesize. You have the material right in front of you. You've read it, you've highlighted it, you've put it into a template, cut and pasted, chopped it up. The relevant parts are all there for you by topic. Then you can sit down and write that section and synthesize very carefully. So I like using Word just for the ease of movement. I mean, some people use EndNotes, some people use Excel, some people use other more formal products, but I like the utility of Word where you can just cut and paste and move around. If you're not comfortable in Word, maybe that doesn't work for you, but I like that. And you can also search very easily, find all the keywords if you've got something out of order. But if you sit down to write with a rich annotated bib in this template, organized by topic, I mean, that's a dream come true. That's where you want to be as a writer. And the effort that it takes to get there is worth it. Sometimes it's laborious. You're reading an article. Now I have to go and do the annotated bib and fill in all this stuff, and I don't have time. Believe me, you'll be worth it. It'll be worth it for you on the end when you have that resource. It's almost like a personalized library ready for you to sit down and write. So I'm a big proponent of doing that. And students that shortchange it and don't quite have enough when they start writing have to go get the material anyway. You always have to do it anyway. So why not do it as a part of your practice with every article you encounter? Then when you go to write, you have this incredibly rich and organized resource to fuel your writing, and you won't have to be looking crazed for where this article is, or where did I highlight that one, or where's this copy, and why do I have two of the same article, which happens all the time. You know, it'll just really let you engage with your content and do your best writing, I think.
Great. Thank you. I'm going to send this question to Dr. Smith next. Is there a preference or geographical preference for source material? For example, United States produce research over research that may have come from India, Canada, Europe, China.
I don't think that there's a preference. I guess it would depend on your discipline. Clearly in education, we're looking primarily at educational settings located in the United States, so you would want to make sure you were looking at, you know, relevant resources. And that's not to say that there aren't innovative practices that are occurring in other countries that you may read about that may also contribute to your study or to your discussion. But I would say that as long as the resource comes from a reputable peer-reviewed journal, that would be the first question you would need to ask yourself to determine whether or not it was a valid resource. And there are resources online to help you determine which ones are referenced more than others. That's often a good indication of whether or not it's held in high esteem and it is a reputable resource. So that's actually something we could probably put some additional resources together for our doctoral students to understand how you select the appropriate types of references. So we'll work on that. Dr. Deegan, that's another project for us.
Another project.
Another one. Yeah.
Yeah, and actually one of our core webinars last year actually touched on that subject a bit, so we can send that link around if there's people in the audience who missed that. And then last question we have, and this one is for you, Dr. Romanuck Murphy, and give me a second, I lost it here. Okay, sorry about that. Here it is. Is it okay to use numbered headings and subheadings to help with one's organization?
I'm going to say something that is a takeaway from this webinar. Check your APA guide.
Short answer is no, but if that's how you organize, that's great. But when it leaves your hand, remember, it becomes an external document, not an internal document. And you have to think about who. That little Post-it note on your computer should say the reader, the reader, the reader. You're thinking about the reader. And if your reader expects APA and you give it your fancy bullets and numbers and it's crystal clear, but it's not in the format they expect, they start to break faith with your work. That's just a psychological thing that happens. We can't attend to it. So the way we do it is we give them the format they expect and let them just engage with your content. And that's a good example. Seems like a good idea at the time, but not, ultimately not.
Yep, and I'm glad that question did come up, because those are the questions that come up all of the time when you're writing, especially when you have learned a lot about APA, but all of a sudden you're doing everything by yourself, and you're starting to have those questions pop up as you're coming by. Go to Purdue OWL, look at the APA 6th edition, and that's when you do your checks, because those questions, they do come up all of the time. And that's perfectly fine, because you will not memorize the rules, and that's all right.
Thanks a lot, everyone, for your questions. Thank you to our presenters, and I can hand things off to Dr. Smith to close out today's webinar.
Thank you, everyone, for attending and participating in today's core webinar, Writing the Dissertation, Practical Tips for Success. You can visit the core webpage to learn more about this series and to access more doctoral resources. A special thanks again to our panelists and all our attendees for your participation, interest, and great questions. If you would like to reach out to today's presenters or myself, our contact information is on the screen now. And I hope everybody has a wonderful day, and goodbye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Good luck.